Ukraine has hit Russia's fourth largest oil refinery in its latest long-range strike, as top defense officials tell me that Moscow is running dangerously low on its short-range air defense missiles. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Dramatic footage emerging overnight of an inferno at the Ryazan Oil refinery, some 100 miles southeast of Moscow, around 300 miles from the closest Ukrainian territory. It has been set ablaze, it would appear, in the latest Ukrainian long-range drone strike, and that's been claimed by Ukraine's 14th Regiment of Unmanned Systems. But interestingly, when they put out that claim, they talked about all the other units that were also involved in making that operation a success, including Special Operations Forces and Ukraine's GUR military intelligence. And that's a reminder that it's not just the drones that have to reach their target, but it's all the other things that go into making these operations work. Often that's other types of drones to either spoof or overwhelm or distract air defenses, electronic warfare, try and neuter some of those defenses, and then the intelligence to work out the route to take and how exactly to hit which part of the target they want to destroy. What's interesting is we've talked on this show about the volume and the drumbeat of these long-range attacks, particularly targeting Russia's oil refinery and oil storage industry sites, and the impact that's been having on the Russian economy. We've seen a 17% decrease in Russia's oil refining capacity, and indeed massive, sort of 50% price hikes in the cost of fuel inside Russia. Now, I've been told that as a result of these strikes, Russia is firing its Pantsir air defense missiles more quickly than it can replace them, and based on current trend lines, it will come very close to running out in February, the beginning of next year. And this is creating a window of opportunity for Ukraine, because Russia will be forced to make a choice. Either its air defences are stretched more thinly, or it faces that awful choice that Ukraine faces every night, which is where to focus its defences. And ultimately that means some targets are protected and others aren't. So it's a sign of the success that Ukraine is happening. Now, my understanding is this is specifically the Pantsir air defense systems. They have a maximum range of about 40 kilometers. These are truck-mounted mobile rocket launchers, radars and rocket launchers. They are what Russia uses to combat the low-level long-range drones that Ukraine has been using against the oil refineries. My understanding is this is not a shortage of S-300 or S-400 missiles. Those are Russia's most sophisticated air defense systems. That's what you'd expect Russia to use to shoot down ballistic or cruise missile threats. What we've seen actually, sort of while we're on it, is shortages of other land attack missiles, leading to Russia repurposing those S-300s from air defense missiles into ground attack missiles. While we are talking about this, worth noting that there has been some extraordinary footage emerging from Ukraine this week of a drone strike on one of those missile launchers. And you see the driver of that lorry-borne missile launcher fleeing for his life before an extraordinary explosion erupts. So showing perhaps consistently the value and the importance of air defense. Ukraine has launched some cruise missiles attacks at Russia. I mean, it's used Storm Shadows, it's used Scalp, donated by France and the UK. It's launched some of its own cruise missiles, but predominantly this campaign that we're seeing against the oil refineries is predominantly led by the drones, and that's why Russia's having that shortage. And so experts suggesting that this creates a really interesting window of opportunity for Ukraine to ramp up its pressure against and on Russian industry over the coming months. But also a note of caution. One of the defense sources I spoke to about this says that obviously this depends entirely on Russia continuing to use those missiles at the current rate and to not bring in any alternatives. And this source said we should not draw too much comfort from this trend line because he said Russia has consistently run down stockpiles of valuable missiles during this conflict and built them up again, or brought alternatives into play. I understand Russia is trying to develop a cheaper and simpler alternative to the Pantsir missile it uses at the moment, which you'll be able to manufacture more quickly. But those are being tested, and the production that Russia is trying to put in place is unlikely to take effect before February. Now, I made a lightning fast visit to Ukraine this week, accompanying Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey and the new Chief of Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, who was making his second trip there in less than a week. And the first thing they did when we arrived in Kyiv was to visit the bomb-damaged site of the British Council. I have come to Kyiv this week with Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey and the new Chief of Britain's Defence Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, who's been making his second trip to Ukraine in less than a week, and a clear sign, I think, of Britain's ongoing dedication and determination to support Ukraine militarily. Now, perhaps the most extraordinary thing about this visit for me was the language that John Healey has used. And in the conversation we had as we travelled here, in a conversation had over the sound of Ukrainian air raid sirens, Healey said that this visit was, in his words, 2 fingers to Vladimir Putin. I had to double check exactly what he meant. He said this is 2 fingers to Vladimir Putin. That is extraordinary language from a defence secretary, and I think a sign of the defiance and indeed perhaps the contempt felt in the Ministry of Defence in the United Kingdom for the actions of Vladimir Putin. Now, the first thing Healey did when he got here was to visit the damaged remains of the British Council building in Kyiv. Of course, that was hit just over a week ago by the blast from a double Russian Kinzhal missile strike, I'm led to believe, blowing out windows, seriously injuring a night watchman who worked there. And Healey talks about how the fact that Russian missiles in an illegal Russian war were hitting a British government building in a largely civilian area of Kyiv, and he called that an outrage. And he pointed out the fact that whilst President Putin had been talking peace with Donald Trump in Alaska, in fact what Russia had really been doing is ramping up attacks against civilians and against civilian infrastructure across Ukraine. Now, while he's been here, while Healey has been here, he has convened a meeting of defence ministers from the Coalition of the Willing. That is the organisation of some 31, informal organisation of some 31 countries who've said that they are willing to send troops or to contribute in some way militarily to a peacekeeping force if and when Russia agrees to a ceasefire. But many of the people I've spoken to here in Kyiv today say that they see no signs of any real intention on the Russian side to negotiate an end to this war in good faith, despite the perhaps warm words you might say from the Kremlin. No change in intent from Moscow, and Moscow continues to prosecute this war violently and militarily, and its war objectives have not changed. And in fact, what we've seen, of course, from Sergei Lavrov immediately after those talks in Alaska was a deliberate attempt to walk back the impression that Putin appeared to have given Trump that he wanted to end the war, he wanted to arrange a ceasefire and end the war. Healey has vowed to double down on Britain's support for Ukraine, its military support for Ukraine, and to ramp up pressure on Moscow. And while he's been here, he's announced that the UK has now given Ukraine more than £1 billion worth of missiles and weapons, which have been funded by the interest from frozen Russian assets in the United Kingdom. So this is, in a sense, a sort of double whammy against Russia. It's using Russian money, using the interest from frozen Russian money to buy weapons to help Ukraine to defend itself from the Russian onslaught. Healey said that Britain was, in that sense, repaying Russia's frozen assets with interest, in the interest being weapons and missiles for Ukraine. Since that visit, Britain's Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced that some 26 nations who are part of that coalition of the willing of 31 are prepared to send troops to Ukraine to enforce or support a peace. And President Zelensky has today said that the numbers that they're talking about are in the thousands. But so far, those countries have been reluctant to give too much information about those plans, other than to try and stress that the plans are detailed, advanced, and there is this momentum. Perhaps a sign of how advanced those plans are, we've seen Vladimir Putin responding, speaking at an economic conference in Vladivostok in the far east of Russia. He said that were Western troops to deploy to Ukraine during hostilities, they would be a legitimate target. He said, especially if they were to deploy now during hostilities, they would be a legitimate target for strikes. That's interesting because he appeared to be making a gentle distinction, suggesting that if they were there before the peace deal, and there is a sense, I think, that whilst all this effort amongst the coalition of the willing to demonstrate their intent and ability to deploy, whilst that is admirable, whilst that's useful to Ukraine because it gives them confidence in these negotiations if they move forward, there is also a realpolitik understanding that Vladimir Putin has not moved 1 inch closer to meaningful negotiations with Ukraine about ending the war. He's played Donald Trump, he's strung him along, he's told him what he wanted to hear. But in fact, there's been no sign from Putin that he wants to end this war. And the reason that's important is because under the previous UK government, for example, defence ministers, James Heappey particularly, was talking about how he thought Britain should be sending troops into Western Ukraine whilst the conflict is still raging in order to relieve some of the manpower pressures that Ukraine is under. Ukraine is facing an acute shortage of personnel. Were forces, Western forces, to deploy to the west, to the rear echelons of that force, it would free up Ukrainian military to go east. And one of the main roles of this coalition of the willing force is to try and allow Ukraine to reconstitute, to rebuild its armed forces quickly. Whilst we're talking about Vladimir Putin, worth mentioning an extraordinary sort of hot mic moment when he was chatting to China's President Xi Jinping at this bizarre and extraordinary kind of tyrant fest organised by China, where most of the world's dictators were invited, and indeed representatives from Hungary, surprisingly. Xi Jinping and Putin appear to be talking about, how they could live forever, or how they could live to 150 by having organ transplants and these advances, extraordinary advances in modern science. Of all the things that have come out of this war, the prospect of Putin living twice as long again is, I think, fairly terrifying. Perhaps an insight into the egos of these men, that they might want to inflict themselves upon us forever. In parallel, worth noting, we've also had speculation about Donald Trump's health, because he disappeared from public view for about 5 days, and totally unconfirmed sort of conspiracy theories about what may or may not have been happening to him, but worth noting that his health is in the spotlight. Other things to note quickly: there have been 2 deminers killed in Chernihiv, northeast of Kyiv. They were in Danish Refugee Council vehicles, clearly marked NGO charity vehicles, and they were in an area that had been occupied by Russia in the first stage of the war, before Russia was forced to abandon its march on Kyiv, killed by a Russian strike, which Russia appeared to celebrate. I've also seen some really unpleasant footage of what apparently shows a Ukrainian soldier on foot being mistaken for a Russian and ending up sort of in a conversation with 2 armed Russian soldiers before he sees a chance and shoots the 2 Russians and escapes. As ever, thank you very much for your questions, and if you do have any, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We're going to do 3 this week. The first question is about protective body armour. What protection is available to soldiers fighting in Ukraine? What can it stop? The short answer: there's a huge range. The best body armour sort of that I'm aware of can stop heavy 7.62 caliber bullets, but nonetheless, if you were wearing it and you were shot by a heavy 7.62 caliber bullet, you would likely be thrown an awful long way by the force of that explosion. There is right down to stuff which is effectively fake or just not really ballistically certified, depending on how and where it's been manufactured. But even sort of 10, 12 years ago, 15 years ago, British soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan were wearing vests that could stop, in theory, 3 7.62 rounds, 7.62 being the AK-47 caliber 7.62 rounds in the same place. But of course, the bullets themselves, whilst they might have the same caliber, they can vary in weight and length, and that can also affect the stopping power of the vest. It's the same with the helmets. To try and stop a rifle round, often helmets have to be too heavy, so thick that they become almost too heavy to wear. So just as with tank armor, we've talked about that holy trinity before between sort of fire, well, with tanks it's firepower, protection and mobility. With body armor for people to wear, it's a trade-off between protection and weight, which influences mobility. Question number 2, how long could Russia hold Crimea without S-400 air defense systems? It's an interesting question, but I don't think S-400s will be the defining factor of whether or not Russia holds Crimea. It's far more complicated than that. Probably the first step towards isolating Crimea and making it vulnerable would be to down the Kerch Bridge that links occupied Crimea to mainland Russia. Ukraine has tried several times, but has been unable to sever that artery completely. Crimea, the terrain of Crimea is also significantly very mountainous, far more mountainous than sort of mainland Ukraine immediately adjacent to it. So fighting through that area would be very, very difficult. And therefore, were Ukraine able to starve Russian soldiers of their military supplies, then they might make any successes more likely. And finally, how is Russia managing security in the occupied areas? And were they to conquer more of Ukraine, would they not face a sort of partisan resistant movement, and perhaps even similar to what the Nazis experienced in occupied Europe, the resistance movements there? The short answer, well, there isn't a short answer. How Russia manages the occupied areas, sort of generally speaking, with an iron fist. It's quite strict, but I also know of people, friends of mine have family and friends living in the occupied territories, and some of them do manage to lead a sort of relatively normal life, just going about their menial business. But at the same time, there is also many of those people, many young men, face the risk of being conscripted to fight in Russia's army against their own country. And there are, as you mentioned, as the question mentions, partisan attacks, assassinations, resistance fighters conducting acts of resistance and sabotage. Were, I think, Russia to occupy even more of Ukraine, God forbid, then that would only increase, because the further west Russia goes, the greater the resistance they would likely be. The further west Russia goes, the greater the resistance they would face. Thank you for watching. If you've got any questions, do ask them in the comments below, and I'll try to answer as many as I can next time. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle, and we're heading towards the Russian border.